Hey everyone, so let's finish up our lecture series about rocks by talking about metamorphic rocks. So this week we are working on explaining how geologic processes transform rocks into metamorphic rocks and describe how metamorphic texture is related to this process of metamorphism. All right, so first let's introduce some vocabulary terms, including metamorphic rocks and metamorphism. So metamorphic rocks form by recrystallization in the solid state. And so the important thing to know about metamorphic rocks is that this process is happening as the rock is a solid. So if the rock melts into a molten material like magma, then when that magma recrystallizes or solidifies, then we form an igneous rock. Metamorphic rocks are formed when things recrystallize as a solid, right? So these are either lower temperatures than we find magma or at high enough pressures that the temperature that would usually melt rock is offset by the pressure. And so this recrystallization process, which we call metamorphism, is largely driven by changes in temperature and or pressure. And we'll talk a bit about why we say and or pressure when we talk about the two main types of metamorphism. You can also get metamorphism through if you have relatively shallow rocks that are having hydrothermal hot waters running through them, then the pore fluid, right, the fluid that's running through the space in the rock can be important. But in this class, we're going to focus really strongly on temperature and pressure as a mechanism for metamorphism. So just another definition or another way to say metamorphism, we can say metamorphism is the process of alteration due to elevated temperature and pressure. And so this process is happening below the Earth's surface. We don't see it happening at the Earth's surface. So everything that we understand about the process of metamorphism is inferred from what we understand about how the inside of the Earth works and the evidence in the rocks that we collect on Earth's surface. And remember that this process of metamorphism, when you subject a rock to higher temperatures and pressure, you can change any of the types of rocks in the rock cycle. So you can take a sedimentary rock, subject it to high heat and pressure, turn it into a metamorphic rock. You can take an igneous rock, subject it to high heat and pressure, turn it into a metamorphic rock. And you can take a metamorphic rock, subject it to higher temperature and pressure, and turn it into a different metamorphic rock. And so when you're changing one metamorphic rock into another metamorphic rock, we refer to that as grade, and I'll show you a couple examples of grade later in lecture. And then something else that's really important in metamorphic rocks is understanding the term protolith, which is the parent rock or the pre-existing rock that is being changed by the process of metamorphism. So for example, we could take a sandstone, which is a sedimentary rock, subject it to the process of metamorphism, and create the metamorphic rock quartzite. We can take a shale, which is a sedimentary rock, subject it to the process of metamorphism, and create a slate. All right, so when we're talking about metamorphism and specifically pressure, there are two types of pressure that are important in metamorphism. The first is confining pressure. And confining pressure is pressure that is equal in all directions. And so this is why bubbles are round, because in our atmosphere, we have confining pressure where pressure is equal in all directions. And confining pressure is due to an overlying mass. And so right now we feel confining pressure around us from the weight of the atmosphere on top of us. And if you go farther and farther down into Earth, this confining pressure is going to increase. And so, for example, think about like the more blankets that you put on top of yourself, the more and more confining pressure you feel from that overlying mass. The second type of pressure is called directed pressure. And this is pressure that is exerted in a particular direction, right? So the directed part of that comes from a part being in a particular direction. And so directed pressure on Earth is associated when we have two big pieces of our plates, two big pieces of the crust running into each other at convergent plate boundaries. And we'll review plate boundaries next week when we talk about plate tectonics. So hopefully when we talk about convergence a little more in depth, you'll understand maybe directed pressure a little more clearly. For now, just know we have pressure in a certain direction. So think about like maybe squeezing an orange would be an example of directed pressure. And so we care about the types of pressure, confining versus directed, because we have two main types of metamorphism on Earth that are associated with these two types of pressures. And so one type of metamorphism is called regional metamorphism. And this occurs when a rock is subjected to directed pressure along these plate boundaries where we have two plates, two pieces of crust running into each other, and one of those plates is going underneath the other one. And when one of those plates goes underneath the other one, eventually it gets far enough down in Earth that it starts to melt. We create a magma chamber, and we create a volcanic mountain chain. But before we get that far down into Earth where we reach melting temperature, we have a place where we have high temperature and directed pressure. So with regional metamorphism, we have both directed pressure and high temperatures. The second type of metamorphism is contact metamorphism. And this occurs when we have some pre-existing rock, right? Some rock underground that is intruded upon, or a magma sort of pushes into this pre-existing rock. And so this magma comes in contact with this pre-existing rock, and there's a rim around the magma chamber that gets baked, or because of this high temperature, gets metamorphosed through this process of contact metamorphism. So since we don't have directed pressure in the contact metamorphism situation, we only have confining pressure. Pressure is not really important for contact metamorphism, but high temperatures are. And so that's why we go back to I always say heat and or pressure when I talk about the definition of metamorphism, because in regional metamorphism, directed pressure plays a really important role. In contact metamorphism, high temperature is what really plays the biggest part. Cool. So let's talk about what metamorphic rocks actually look like. So in the lab, when we'll be identifying metamorphic rocks, we will use the texture of those rocks to identify them. And so texture of metamorphic, we have a specific metamorphic texture, which is different than igneous texture. But both of those, right, for igneous rocks and for metamorphic rocks, when we talk about this word texture, what we actually mean is we're describing what the minerals look like. And in metamorphic rocks, the two textures that we're looking for are, one is foliated, and in foliated rocks, we have parallel or subparallel arrangement of our flat, sheety, sheet-like minerals like our biotite and our muscovite micas. And so in our foliated metamorphic rocks, because we have directed pressure, as these minerals recrystallized, they are sort of forced into this parallel arrangement where you get sort of linear features on our metamorphic rock called foliation. And these foliated lines, they line up perpendicular to the stress. So perpendicular to that directed pressure, we get parallel arrangement of our plating minerals. In our non-foliated metamorphic rocks, we don't see any parallel or subparallel arrangement of those sheet-like minerals. And that's because non-foliated texture is associated with contact metamorphism, and there's no directed pressure associated with the creation of non-foliated texture. Right, so in the case of metamorphic rocks, we're using our texture to infer the environment, the metamorphic environment in which the rock formed. And so the amount of foliation varies with how metamorphosed a rock is. So for example, if we have our protolith, in this case, a shale, which is a sedimentary rock made up of clays that aren't really arranged in any specific manner because it's a sedimentary rock. We had clay particles laid down and then they got smushed into or cemented into a rock. If we subject that shale to low-grade metamorphism, relatively low temperatures and pressures, we get the metamorphic rock called slate, which on the microscopic level has parallel arrangement of micas. If we subject that slate to slightly higher temperature and pressure, we get visible recrystallization of those micas, still parallel arranged, perpendicular to the directed pressure, and we get the metamorphic rock called schist. And if we subject it to even higher temperatures and pressures, we end up getting actually visible banding of the minerals, still parallel arranged, and we get the metamorphic rock called gneiss. So grade is a way to describe how metamorphosed a rock is, and we use foliation as an indicator of grade. We also use the minerals present in igneous rocks as an indicator of grade. So in metamorphic rocks, we talk about recrystallization of minerals due to high heat and pressure. So sometimes if you have directed pressure, you just recrystallize the same mineral into an orientation that goes along with that directed pressure, right, and is in equilibrium with that directed pressure. And so many minerals remain the same minerals even when they're subjected to the high heats and pressures of metamorphism. And that's because some of the minerals that remain the same were formed at high temperatures in magma chambers. So specifically, if you think about like the felsic minerals and the mafic, if you think about the mafic minerals that are forming at higher temperatures and pressures, then felsic minerals, mafic minerals usually stay relatively stable at higher heats and pressures. Our felsic minerals are the ones that generally, but not always, recrystallize. So, but the thing I want you to know is that we do have a certain class of metamorphic minerals, which are commonly found in metamorphic rocks because they form at metamorphic temperatures and pressures, right? So we have kind of this special class of minerals that are related directly to metamorphic rocks because they form sort of in this nice metamorphic Goldilocks place of high temperature and pressure. And so, right, our primary minerals that we see ranging from ultramafic to mafic, intermediate felsic, right, like we reviewed last week in class. A lot of these stay the same when they're subjected to high temperatures and pressures because they were created generally high temperature magma chambers. But we have a number of metamorphic minerals: epidote, starlite, serpentine, talc, and kyanite, which form specifically in metamorphic environments, right? So I just want you to know there's certain minerals that stay the same. There's certain minerals that are formed specifically in the metamorphic environment. And I'll find some of these in the lab and show them off to you when we're doing our metamorphic rock identifications. All right, so texture whether a rock is foliated or non-foliated is important for determining the type of metamorphic rock that it is. And then the other thing that's important to understand is what the protolith or the parent rock of the metamorphic rock is or might be to help identify it. And that's because the composition of the protolith is a really important control on the minerals that form in the metamorphic rock. So for example, on this diagram, we have two protoliths. We have basalt as an igneous mafic protolith, and we have shale as a clay-based sedimentary rock. And what we see is that as we subject these to higher and higher metamorphism, right, because remember, as grade increases, the amount of metamorphism increases, right, higher temperature and pressure as we move to the right on this diagram. And so we can use certain index minerals, right, so certain minerals that we know form at specific temperatures and pressures to indicate what the grade of metamorphism is. And so, for example, if we see a metamorphic rock that has no aluminum amphibole, epidote, chlorite, and zeolite, we know that it is the metamorphic rock called green schist. If we see a metamorphic rock with largely chlorite, maybe some clays, quartzes and feldspars, and our micas, we know that that is a slate. Right, so these index minerals only show up at certain temperatures and pressures, and so we can use them to understand how metamorphosed the rock is.